Hi everyone, Mr. Owens here. I'm going to be going over circumference and teaching you about one of my favorite topics in math, which is circles. And before we get started with circumference, we need to talk about this word diameter. So the diameter is the distance across a circle. It's the distance across a circle through the midpoint. And the midpoint's just a dot in the middle. It's a fancy word for the dot in the middle, this little dot right here. So if you look at this circle I drew, you notice that this line is the diameter, goes all the way across the circle, straight through the middle. And that's what the diameter is. And when we get to the next word, which is radius, you're going to see that the diameter is double, or times 2, of the radius, right? So if you notice, right, the diameter, if you take halfway across the circle, it's double that. So that brings us to our next word, which is radius. And the radius is the distance from the outside of a circle to the middle. So you can see that the diameter, right, if the diameter is the full distance across a circle, right, the full distance across a circle, the radius is just half that. So over here, our radius equals 1/2 times the diameter, or the diameter divided by 2. So it's really important that you know these words. You're going to be seeing these words a lot. You'll see diameter abbreviated with the letter D for algebra when we're in algebra, just to make it simpler, and radius using the letter R. Okay, so you need to know diameter is the whole way across a circle, and radius is halfway across a circle. The last word that we're going to go over right now is pi. And this pi is a number, and it's written like this. It's written as 2 lines. Some people do a flat line. I like to do a little squiggle on top. Most people do a little squiggle. I think it's also a little bit more fun, but you can write it whichever way you like. And pi, the interesting thing about pi is that it's a ratio. It's a number, but it's also a ratio. So it's a fraction. And pi is a ratio of the circumference, which we'll go over in just a minute, to the diameter. So circumference divided by diameter on every single circle. So another way to say this is if you took the distance around the outside of every single circle that was ever made in the world and divided that by the diameter, by the distance across the circle, it will equal pi. It's pretty incredible. I think it's kind of like a magical thing. It's really, really, really interesting. So if you take the distance around a circle and you divide it by the diameter, on every single circle you get the same number. And that number is 3.141579, something like that. But what you need to know is just 3.14, okay? And when you're using a calculator, which you should be using, you can either type in 3.14 or you can just press the pi button, okay? And you'll see this is the number 3.14159265, whatever. But if you don't have a pi button on your calculator, just type in 3.14 and that's just fine, okay? So that's the number pi, and now we're going to find out how to use it. So we're going to talk about circumference, and this is what the lesson is actually about. So circumference is just a fancy word for the distance around the outside of a circle. So another way to think of this, for other shapes we call this the perimeter, right? For other shapes we call it the perimeter. But circles are so special that they have their own word for it, okay? Circles are really, really special. So the circumference is just the distance around the outside, okay? And the way that we figure out the distance, right? So you notice over here I drew, if you start at this point and you go all the way around, right, that's the circumference. It's the distance around. And because it's a circle, you can't just measure it, right? You would have to like unroll the circle. So it's hard to measure. So that's why we need to calculate it. So here I wrote, if pi equals the circumference divided by the diameter, right? That's what we said here for the definition of pi. It's the circumference divided by the diameter. So if pi equals the circumference divided by the diameter, if you just use algebra to undo the divide by diameters, right? Pi equals circumference divided by diameter. If we want to solve for circumference, right? We need to do the opposite. We need to get rid of the diameter, so we need to do the opposite of divide by diameter. what's the opposite of dividing by the diameter? It's multiplying by the diameter on both sides. These cancel out and you're left with diameter times pi equals circumference. And so that's our formula. That's our formula to find the circumference. So it's pi times the diameter equals the circumference. This is super, super important, okay? This is how you're going to solve all of these problems, all right? Pi times diameter equals circumference. But remember, we said the diameter is the same as 2 times the radius, right? Because it's double the radius, right? So that means you can also write circumference as pi times 2r, all right? Because the diameter equals 2 times the radius. So there's 2 different ways to find the circumference, and both are good. Sometimes a problem will give you the radius, sometimes it'll give you the diameter, and you need to be able to adapt to whichever one they're telling you, okay? So let's try some problems now, all right? So here's one problem, and we want to find the circumference equals question mark, right? And yeah, first ask yourself, did they give you the radius or the diameter? And here you can see they gave us the diameter, right? Because the line goes all the way across the circle. And the diameter is 4 inches. So we know that the circumference is going to equal pi times the diameter. So circumference is going to equal pi times 4. Now, sometimes on multiple choice tests, really, you'll just write this as 4 pi. The answer is 4 pi. But if you use a calculator, you can do 4 times, press the pi button, and you get this big number. You can just take a couple decimal places. So 12.566, so that rounds to 12.57. All right. So circumference equals 12.57 inches. Now, if you don't have a pi button on your calculator, that's fine. You can do 3.14 times 4, and you get 12.56. So your answer will be slightly different, but that's fine. That's totally fine. Both are correct. All right, let's try another one. Now that we've done one, let's try another one. Oops. Well, let's just delete that. Okay, so the first question, right, we want to find the circumference. And we ask ourselves, did they give us the diameter or the radius? Here they give us the radius because it goes halfway across the circle. So radius equals 1.5 inches. So circumference we know equals pi times diameter, or circumference equals pi times 2r. 2 times the radius. So here we'll pi times 2 times 1.5. And again, sometimes you'll see this as like 3 times pi, because 2 times 1.5 is 3. But other times you'll actually calculate the exact answer. So we'll do pi times 2 times 1.5, and we get 9.42, right? Circumference equals 9.42 inches. And that's it. That's it. Okay? Now here's the last type of problem I'm going to show you. Sometimes they'll tell you what their circumference is and ask you, hey, find the radius or find the diameter. So let's do radius equals question mark. Let's find both here. So circumference, we're being told, is 10 pi inches. So remember, circumference equals pi times diameter, right? So if the circumference is 10 times pi equals pi times diameter. Well, if we want to solve for diameter, right, we need to undo times pi. How do you undo times pi? Well, you divide by pi on both sides of the equal sign. So that means these cancel out, and we're left with 10 equals the diameter. So now we figured out what the diameter is, but we still need to figure out what the ratio is. I mean, that's not ratio, the radius, sorry. And remember that the diameter equals 2 times the radius. So 10 equals 2 times something, right? Now you could do this in your head, I know, but if you want to use algebra, you undo times 2, so you divide by 2, and you're left with 5 equals the radius. And that's how you solve it. So this is really combining a lot of the algebra that you've learned, as well as introducing new vocabulary words. But once you get the vocabulary down and you remember the formula, these two formulas, I think you're going to be okay. If you have any questions, please email me, kowens@jeffersonesd.org, and good luck, everybody.